This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. This is a non-commercial broadcast, so we've shied away from asking viewers to subscribe or follow us. But having subscribers, which is free, helps us to gain support from grant agencies and to continue this series. So if you like us, please tap or click the red subscribe button on YouTube on the lower right-hand side of your screen, or the follow button on your podcast. This talk is with Darren Freebury Jones, whose recent publications have examined Shakespearean contemporaries and the larger field of early modern drama during the time of Shakespeare. Here we will focus on Darren's recent book, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. This book is an expansive and engaging look into the early modern authors who helped to shape Shakespeare's beloved plays. This is Darren's second appearance on this series, the first being about two more books he has recently published, one on Thomas Kyd's influence on Shakespeare, and the second on Robert Greene. We have linked to that talk and to these books below. This talk is made possible with support from the Aoyama Gakuin Institute of the Humanities. Darren, in this new book and in your other work, you emphasize two things strongly. First, that there is much more to early modern drama than just Shakespeare. There were other major playwrights that penned superb dramas at the same time. And second, that Shakespeare's work was not produced in a vacuum, that he and other playwrights of this period influenced each other and borrowed from each other. The second point is the subject of Shakespeare's borrowed feathers. This is a richly detailed and somewhat encyclopedic look into the various ways Shakespeare engaged with, collaborated with, and indeed borrowed from playwrights during his time. This book squarely situates Shakespeare in his time and place. May we ask you for an overview of your book and some of the main ideas it puts forward about Shakespeare and his contemporaries?
Absolutely. And first off, Tom, just to say, I've been so excited to join you again. I mean, what you do in terms of exposure for scholars and creatives is just wonderful. And it's just fabulous to share your warmth and your knowledge. So I'm so excited to talk about the book, about Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers, and try and bind it in a nutshell. Fundamentally, this is a book that places Shakespeare in his theatrical and historical context. So Shakespeare, often regarded, rightly so, as an influential dramatist and poet. What I want to do is trace the influences on Shakespeare, what inspired Shakespeare, and also what was going on during that period in the theatrical milieu that Shakespeare occasionally turns away from. So I take a look at Shakespeare in relation to his grammar school education and that emphasis on imitatio during the period. And I look at the ways in which other dramatists, from John Lilly in the 1580s all the way to John Fletcher at Shakespeare's retirement, how they influenced Shakespeare, how their plays intersected with his career trajectory.
Yes, you do. And you also do a lot of other stuff in there too. There's biography. There's an enormous amount of biographical information about what many would find to be obscure figures, or at least obscure details about those figures. And also there are play summaries. You have to get into the weeds a good bit. You have to show us very precisely what is, where and when these borrowings occurred. And you're doing this as a parallel. You're doing digital new developments in digital reckoning and reckoning with that also.
Yes, and the digital components, I think, is what makes the book quite unique in several respects, because I believe this is the first book to try and bring computational approaches towards early modern plays to a wider readership. So we often hear these new theories in textual scholarship and authorship attribution studies, and I think few people are equipped to actually judge those methods, to query the results. And this is a field I've been working in for many years. So in many respects, I think this is a book I always wanted to write. When we did our last interview, we were talking about two books I had published in 2022, and one was on Robert Greene, one was on Thomas Kidd. And with this book, I thought, why not write about everybody? Which is a little bit facetious, but I'm reminded of an anecdote about James Shapiro with his fabulous book, 1599. He was asked, well, why did you write this book? And he said, well, there were gaps in my knowledge. And that's something I wanted to plug as well. I wanted to learn a little bit more about those dramatists that we might consider somewhat obscure in comparison to Shakespeare, like your John Lillys, like your Thomas Deckers and so forth. And with the digital side of things, we have this database called Collocations and Engrams, designed by Pervez Rizvi. And I think it's just a great opportunity to chart the influences between plays. Now, influence can be charted in a variety of ways. We can look at similarities in terms of stage business, in terms of plot, in terms of characterization. But what I found was that the database often validated theories about connections between texts. And those connections also took the form of shared phrases. So with the database, there's many ways you can approach the data. And one thing you can do is have a look at how plays are ranked in comparison to each other, according to phrases that are found nowhere else in the corpus of 527 plays within that database. So it was just a fascinating journey, really, writing this book, and one I thoroughly enjoyed.
Yeah, well, I think you don't say this directly, but I think we're running into a little bit of chicanery on the digital front, where people may be a little bit too sure of themselves. Let's go back even more than a couple of decades, but more recently, maybe a little bit too sure of themselves in terms of attribution studies. And I think that you kind of push back a bit on that and saying, here's what we can rely on, and here's what we still don't know. And right, it's a very sticky area, isn't it?
It is a sticky area and quite a hostile area. And I didn't know it was so polemical when I first got into authorship attribution studies. And now I feel like Macbeth. I'm steeped so far in blood that to go back would just be tedious. But I think the real advantage with this database is that you can actually read those phrases in context. So you can have a look at similarities and differences in terms of scenic context, in terms of characterization. Is there parallelism of thought, or are these just matching words, essentially? But I'm a huge advocate of a range of approaches. So going back to methods that have been applied to early modern texts since the 19th century, such as analysis of verse style, to offer just one example. But for me, it's fundamental to read these plays, and those more traditional literary critical approaches, I think, remain paramount.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I fully agree with you, and I very much am a believer in new digital tools to do this stuff, because there's so much data out there. The thing is, I think some of our viewers probably need to understand a little bit more about the ethics of borrowing, how they stood in the age that we're talking about, and how they stand in our highly litigious age, and where there have been famous lawsuits in popular music, where I thought, listen, I don't even think, and I look for plagiarism all the time as a teacher. I don't think it's fair. That this guy goes done, 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 and that's it. That's all. So at this time, this is how these people built the theater. They were constantly collaborating and drawing from each other, and that's what makes it so rich, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's quite easy to forget today, is that this was an entertainment industry. Playwriting, playmaking. This is all about entertaining and engaging audiences in order to make money. And these plays weren't considered works until Ben Jonson's, the publication of the 16 works of Benjamin Jonson. And Jonson, of course, got some stick for that. So you had the poet John Suckling saying, Jonson deserves the bays, for his were called works, while others were but plays. But that process of imitation, it was so important during the period. And I'm curious actually what your thoughts are on the title of the book, Tom, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers.
Loved
What's
it.
your instant reaction when you read that title? And you
Loved
can be as
it.
honest as you like.
Loved it. You can't lose with feathers, number one. But I felt that the feathers that was a good image, and particularly when I got into the book and I saw that you were tracing that there are these traces, so many of them that you cover, that it's not just a direct, just wholesale pulling of a whole scene over or pulling of this. There are just these traces throughout that
Mm,
you see, and it does seem feathery that way, right? And
mm.
and you make I think in your conclusion you make another what would we call it? Bird. I was thinking what we call it, avionic. There was another comparison that you drew in your conclusion, but it is bird-like in the sense
Yeah.
that you are flying and there are these things falling off, and one thing ends up here and one thing ends up there. That's
Yes.
loved it.
Well, that's lovely to hear. Yeah, I call the community of playwrights during the period a veritable avian community.
Avian community.
And
That's the word I was searching for. Yeah.
but
Avian
I think
community, the term.
I think in terms of the title, people either love it or hate it, and I think it provokes people, and a lot of people look at that title very much through a 21st century lens, and borrowed feathers, that they've got that Green's groat's worth of wit passage in mind, and the connotations of plagiarism surrounding that. And that's something I wanted to tackle head on. So
Yeah.
we say never read a book by the cover. I do find a minority of people read the book by the title, which is quite interesting. But there's a great passage in Jonathan Bates' book, How the Classics Made Shakespeare,
Mhm.
where he says that imitation is regarded as deficient today in the 21st century, but it was actually a cardinal virtue during Shakespeare's time.
Mhm.
And that's how I begin the book. I take a look at grammar school education during the periods, how imitatio, parodia, and translatio formed the very bedrocks of the Elizabethan education system, and how schoolboys were encouraged by the likes of Erasmus to read every type of author in order to fill up your storehouse. And there was a pedagogical emphasis on bettering your instruction, to paraphrase Shylock, bettering your source material. And I think it's hardly surprising that when Shakespeare appears on the scene in the early 1590s, most likely, that he's attempting to bombast out a blank verse as
Mhm.
the best of other playwrights. That's precisely how he would have been educated. That is what he would have been taught to do. So I think that's what I mean when I say I try to place Shakespeare in his original theatrical and historical context. And for me, rather than denigrating Shakespeare in any way, I think what I'm emphasizing is his creative genius. And you can see how he will take aspects of other playwrights' works, or even aspects of language, and how he will do something quite different with it. And for me, it's win-win, because I think we're getting some insights into Shakespeare's creativity, his creative process. But for many readers, I'm also introducing them to some quite electrifying dramatists whose
Mhm.
careers crossed over with Shakespeare's.
Mhm. And that's so important. But I remember years ago, I was doing a class in medieval, and we were doing Chaucer's Troilus and Crusade. And Chaucer, at the very beginning of that, kind of lies. He says, "I'm giving you this genuine Italian story from Boccaccio," and then he goes and he changes it.
Yeah,
That was the fraud in there. He changes it from the original, but I don't think that ethos is gone yet in Shakespeare. And if we took it up to modern times, think of the maybe interviews we've seen, film directors and so forth, when they talk about their technique. Famously Tarantino, where he
yeah,
just missed. Listen, I'm taking this stuff off the video store shelf. And I
yeah.
think the Tarantino is a good example of what we're talking about here. Of course, everybody else does it, They see examples. Actors, how did this guy do it? How do I look more like that guy?
Mm,
And film writers, screen writers, and novelists that read and read and read and read and cultivate their style through a kind of consortium of what they have read. So,
mm.
how can we even now argue that borrowing isn't that's intrinsic to the creative arts in any
Yeah,
fields?
yeah, and you find with most great creatives and great artists that they do acknowledge their debt. So some interviews I've read with Bob Dylan, for instance, and I also remember seeing an interview with Paul Simon, where they said to him, "Where did you get the inspiration for Bridge Over Troubled Water?" And he said, "Well, I heard this melody from this song, and I heard this lyric from this. I put them together and produced something that, in its own right, is unique." But I think looking at the music industry provides quite an interesting analogy, because when we think of Shakespeare as this solitary genius, just this natural wit, it's a bit like looking at the music charts in the 1970s and 80s and ignoring everyone except Queen.
Mhm.
Just in terms of, the variety and the different genres that artists are playing with. And I think that's a fairly fair comparison.
Yeah, it's very, very fair. I think that we're still under the spell, and there are 2 points I want to make here. Number one, the solitary genius. Let's go back to that. That's very romantic, isn't it? The idea of a writer in his study, one of these high European intellectuals there with his library, and then walking his manuscript down to the publisher, not knowing what the public response will ever be. They always knew what they were aiming for. There was an audience out there. You had to get it engaged. These are dramatists. That's number one. I'd love to throw that solitary genius. Not genius, but this whole solitary thing. Let's throw that.
Yeah.
Number two, when you go that direction, that's when you get the problem of Shakespeare eclipsing these other playwrights. You get the um, iconic Shakespeare that pushes away, pushes the space. It takes too much space in some cases, because there's some
Mm,
plays, I'll just say it now, there's some plays by these other playwrights that are superior to Shakespearean plays,
mm.
right? We're going to talk who's the best overall. I'd vote Shakespeare every time. But they're, when you get into Marlowe, my goodness, and also all of these, it's a matter of taste. But there,
Yeah.
there was some exquisite talent in those other playwrights that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that image of the solitary genius, so you use the word romantic, and we often think of it as something of a Victorian construct, but I think it does go back to the first folio and the way Shakespeare is
Hmm.
presented, because he is very much presented as a non-collaborating dramatist. And I think it's important sometimes to make a distinction between the realities, of which we know quite little, of putting on plays, playmaking during the period, and the print industry, and how these plays are presented in bookshops, because there are around 500 plays of the period that acknowledge sole authorship.
Hmm.
And there's only around 30 plays of the period that acknowledge co-authorship.
Mhm.
So it does seem that sole authored plays were easier to market. And I think you see that in the first folio, which ironically is put together by the people with whom Shakespeare collaborated the most, his fellow company members, the likes of Hemmings and Condell, for instance. And we do get acknowledgement of collaboration with the Beaumont and Fletcher folios of 1647 and 1679. But it's interesting that they're presented as something of a tag team, kind of
Mhm.
like the Simon and Garfunkel
Mhm.
of their era. And you had a contemporary, Aston Cockayne, complain that those editions didn't do justice to the many other hands involved in putting the plays together in the Beaumont and Fletcher folio, such as Philip Massenger, for instance, with whom Fletcher collaborated far more than he did with Beaumont. And you also have writers like Nathan Field involved in the composition of those plays as well.
Yes, you do. And you get collaboration throughout, even after the era, after the deaths, throughout the late 17th century, 1819.
Yeah.
Um, of course, that's one of the points I bring up in my teaching quite a lot, there was, I may have mentioned this in another episode, but we'll do it again. The Japanese Noa and Kabuki drama was sort of set down by the great playwright Zeami, and he did the cultural service of doing precisely putting down exactly how things should be done, and in a way sort of killed it. Right. If you went through Tokyo and you asked people if what they know about Shakespeare and what they know about Zeami, they would know more about Shakespeare, across the board. And uh, Shakespeare didn't do that, and opens up, and I think probably part of the collaborative spirit in the dramas themselves opens up this. It opens doors for directors, for actors, for everybody involved with the theater in later generations to enter into this and bring their own creativity into it. And we've seen it so many times.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that mention of actors because we continue to collaborate with Shakespeare, whether we're creatives, whether we're directing these plays, acting in them, whether we're editing them, whether we're engaging with them in through other academic means. And that that is how I see Shakespeare, very much as an actor playwright involved in collaborative processes. And I don't see his plays as soliloquies. I think they're dialogic. They're firmly embedded in a network of affiliation and indebtedness within the early modern writing scene. And that was very important for me to convey, I think. But there are different forms of collaboration. And one thing I try to stress is that when it comes to authorial collaboration, the vast majority of Shakespeare's plays are sole authored, and he seems to have co-authored works primarily at the beginning and towards the end of his career. So there's different forms of collaboration.
Well, I want to get into some of the names here because you have a list of names, and you humbled me. We're starting with John Lilly, which, I guess we associate Lilly more, and correct me, with the 1580s, a sort of
Yeah.
pre-Shakespearean dramatist. And famously, of course, you pretty much go chronologically here. In fact, you do. Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, Robert Greene, the people we know, the university wits, what we've been taught, the people who were really bringing the Elizabethan theater into the eye of everyone, the aristocratic audience and the public audiences, filling up those big theaters that started appearing not long before them. And I think a way to read this book, if you didn't want to go cover to cover, you would want to go to the playwright you know the least about. That's in a way what I skipped a little bit because I'm not a great Peele guy. George
Oh,
Peele.
you skipped Peele. Oh,
I didn't.
goodness.
No, I went directly to Peele because
Oh, did you?
yes,
Oh,
that's kind of gappy with me.
yeah.
Just I think I studied him at some point, but then I just these files get corrupted after a period.
No, I don't.
You know, I'm saying I just did something. I just looked into Lilly fairly thoroughly and something that I'm writing. And Marlowe is. I have a history with Marlowe, and of course I'm familiar with Greene from your prior book, but
Mm,
and Thomas Kidd. But then we get to George Peele. And I go,
mm.
before I go back to Lilly, I'm going to start with Peele. Well, the book
Oh,
reads that way. It doesn't require you. It doesn't build on a plot structure. It's not a Netflix,
no,
serial.
you could dip in and out, and one of the pieces of feedback I received was to just offer brief overviews of the collocations and engrams database across different chapters,
Uh-huh.
in case readers were dipping in and out. But yeah, Peele's an interesting one because when I started my PhD thesis and I was interested in Shakespearean influence and Shakespearean collaboration, and I delved really deeply into Peele, and I read pretty much everything that survives from Peele. And I've got to say, I think he's a fascinating playwright, but stylistically, I found him a little bit stuffy, a little bit dry.
Mhm.
And one of my favorite aspects of the book is charting what contemporaries said about Peele, where fellow playwrights recognize him as, you know, this wonderfully academic dramatist. But then you also get these jesting accounts of him. And there was one anecdote which probably says a lot about my childish sense of humor, but it really amused me, and it painted a picture of Peele that I had never conjured reading his works, where apparently he went to a very formal dinner party and was butting heads with a gentlewoman, and during the meal he let out a really loud fart as the lady leaned forwards and proclaimed in a loud voice, nudging this lady, "Don't worry, I'll take the blame." That's not really the picture of Peele I
No.
get from reading the likes of, you know, Edward the First or The Old Wife's Tale. And you know, we do get jesting accounts like that attached to certain, you know, celebrity figures of the period, so there's probably no real veracity to it, but I think it does give you a sense of playwrights who worked hard but played pretty hard as well.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Uh, well, what I'm seeing here as it builds now, I do think that the reader has to get do your introduction and do chapter one, A Player's Hide. What I see after that in the list of playwrights, you have John Lilly, who is from, as far as I guess we know, fairly well-to-do background. And with these others who are coming in, they're very well educated. They have academic pedigree. Well, Kid, Kid is sort of, he's an outlier a bit, isn't he?
Mm.
And but Shakespeare is sort of stepping into a group of people who were taking some risk by going in and writing for the London theater. We're not
Yeah.
talking about a literary, you being the, I don't know, the celebrated poet or whatever. You're talking about some fairly, in some cases, you know, vulgar areas where plays are being played, whether in houses or public theaters, and it can be a little bit rough. And these guys were, I think, expected to do either get into administration, maybe take holy orders, and do something respectable. And instead, here they are, you know, somewhere, you know, stuck in London, writing these plays that. But because of that, they're pushing it. They're pushing the literary value, and they're having to do it in sort of an unprecedented way in the vernacular. In the vernacular.
Yeah.
I mean, this
Yeah.
this is kind of unprecedented, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And Kids is a bit of an outlier, not being university educated so far as we know. He went to Merchant Taylor School, which also boasted such alumni as Edmund Spenser, Thomas
Yeah.
Lodge, and so forth. But that was something I noticed with Kidd and Shakespeare, was stylistically, in terms of dramatic language, and you use that word unprecedented, they're quite different, I think, from the university educated playwrights. From when we think of Marlowe's mighty line, as Jonson termed it, and that emphasis on largely end-stopped verse lines consisting of 10 syllables, and Kidd's quite innovative, I think, in terms of incorporating the so-called feminine ending, so 11 syllable lines, and Shakespeare very much steps into that place, and you know, flies a pitch above Kidd's in terms of the rates in which he's using those forms. But that was something that really struck me, actually, was I thought, going back to 1580s playwrights like John Lilly, George Peele, and so forth, I think you could be forgiven for thinking in terms of genre, it would be quite compartmentalized. So you'd have your comedies, you'd have your tragedies, and then as drama evolves, you start to progress into forms such as tragicomedy, hybrid genres. But that wasn't the case at all. And Lilly really surprised me, because Lilly was one of the playwrights about whom I knew fairly little when I started writing this book. And I saw him as a playwright responsible for sparkling comedies.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I started delving into his work, I realized that he's incredibly difficult to pigeonhole. And a great example is the prologue to Endymion, when he says it is neither tragedy, nor comedy, nor story, nor anything. So as Shakespeare enters the playwriting scene, you've got these hybrid genres. You've got romance plays, you've got biblical dramas, you've even got domestic tragedies, which are developed further during the Jacobean period. So it was an incredibly exciting, experimental period in terms of genre, but also in terms of dramatic language and that theatrical vernacular you mentioned.
Hmm. Hmm. It would have been intimidating to
Yeah,
a boy from Stratford going into
yeah,
that, and highly competitive.
yeah,
We know that too. The collaboration too. Well, let's move up a little bit here because the collaboration, if we move up to Decker, Middleton, Fletcher, we're talking people who are contemporary or uh, go beyond, in some
yeah,
cases, Fletcher, Shakespeare. And of course, we think of Middleton and Rowley, think of Beaumont
yes,
and Fletcher, Gilbert and Sullivan. But
yeah,
yeah, the whole field seems absolutely dominated by collaborative efforts and so forth.
yeah,
But Shakespeare is contemporary with these people, and they're living. Marlowe died young.
mm,
I don't know what would have happened if Marlowe had continued to live.
mm,
That would have been heavy. That would have been a heavy thing for Shakespeare, I think.
yes,
But these guys tend to rise a little bit more in the early 17th century, I think, if we generally speaking. So they're
yeah,
coming off, in fact, probably uh, Shakespeare paved the way for a lot of them commercially and also artistically.
yeah, yeah, and you see that with the works of writers such as Thomas Middleton, who are deeply influenced by Shakespeare. Think of the opening of the Revenger's tragedy, for example, when you have Middleton's non-subtly named Revenger Vindici staring into the hollow sockets of the skull of his murdered lover. It's a very alas poor Yorick moment, but that was quite interesting in terms of charting Shakespeare's career trajectory. Is that he seems to have been the junior partner of playwrights such as George Peele at the beginning of his career, and then you see him, and it can seem a little bit stereotypical maybe, but I think you do get a sense that he's guiding younger contemporaries such as Thomas Middleton when he works with him on Timon of Athens. So there is evidence of some mixed writing in that play. So I think most co-authored plays, what we might call simultaneous collaboration, the playwrights have their plots and they go off and write their respective stints separately. But I think there is some evidence that Shakespeare and Middleton might very well have been in the same room with Timon of Athens. And
Mm-hmm.
whereas when Shakespeare's starting off in his career in the co-authored plays, you usually have the older, more experienced playwright will take responsibility for the opening of a play, for instance. And then that kind of gets flipped reversed in Shakespeare's later collaborative efforts in some cases where Shakespeare gets that narrative ball rolling. He's a lot more hands-off with the John Fletcher collaborations, however. I think Fletcher is a younger contemporary, but he very much recognizes that Fletcher's quite deep into his career and quite experienced by the time Shakespeare starts co-authoring plays with him. And Fletcher, upon Shakespeare's retirement, is often regarded as the dramatist who becomes the principal playwright of the King's Men Company.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're tracing also, because you had to be selective here, you're tracing a lineage from sort of before Shakespeare through Shakespeare, after Shakespeare. In this lineage, there's not been Jonson, there is not Webster or Ford,
Mm.
these early Jacobean, and it seems that you have given preference to these people, and I think I understand why without having
Yeah.
read these people recently. There seems much more Shakespeare in the line that you have chosen.
Yes, I think that's fair because I was looking at playwrights who appear to have influenced Shakespeare or potentially collaborated with him. So Webster, for example, I see as a later playwright, and I do have a chapter devoted to Ben Jonson, which was one of my favorite chapters to write, actually, because I wasn't deeply immersed in Jonson, and as I was writing that chapter, I found it very difficult to stop because I was just enjoying learning about this fascinating, prickly figure so much.
Well, Jonson is endless. You get in there, you talk about getting halfway, through the swamp and not being able to turn back. You might as well just go
Yes.
ahead and write a book on Jonson.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine getting out of there. And I don't, because he was so focused on the city, because he was a very different playwright from
Oh,
Shakespeare.
yeah. Yeah.
And in their own ways too, Ford and Webster, I think they were competing in some ways. They're trying to go darker. Can we out Macbeth right
Yeah.
here, and
Yeah.
the White Devil or Tis Pity, whatever. The
Mm,
there does seem to be that kind of what would be anti-collaboration, where you're trying to outdo the person before you.
mm,
These are great plays, of course,
mm,
but I don't think they're part of the bloodline that you tracked here. Uh,
mm.
and
Yeah.
if we threw it in front of a computer, maybe we'd find something, but I don't know.
Yeah, and Jonson, he has quite an extensive career, but we have so many missing plays of his early in his career when he's working with Philip Henslowe, for instance, and we don't have any surviving examples of Jonson's early tragedies. But that relationship between Shakespeare and Jonson fascinated me in particular because they do seem to have been good friends. And
Mhm.
I don't know about you, but I tend to find that my best friends say worse things about me than my worst enemies.
Yeah.
And Jonson famously, of course, said Shakespeare, not of an age, but for all time. But infamously, upon hearing that Shakespeare never deleted a line of his work, said, would he had blotted 1,000? And I get a sense of literary banter to an extent when Jonson's mocking fantastical characters such as Caliban or the chorus in Henry V that will waft you over the seas. But there is also a great deal of seriousness involved that might have come out in those anecdotal conversations between these men in the Mermaid Tavern. But Jonson does see himself as a classicist. I think he places a lot more emphasis on comic realism. He is holding a mirror up to contemporary London. Even if he sets a play in Italy, we think of the Shakespeare canon, around a third of Shakespeare plays are set in Italy, such as Every Man in His Humour. When he comes to revise those plays, they become more immediately set in the contemporary milieu within London. So just interesting learning more about their relationship. But Jonson is so deeply immersed in the playmaking scene of the period that he shares a chapter in the book. And yes, I could have written a whole book just on Jonson, but he shares a chapter with Thomas Dekker and John Marston
Yeah.
because I think their works and their careers are so closely intertwined that I couldn't quite justify giving them separate
Mhm.
chapters. And
Yeah.
when we hear about the poets' war, the little Iases being tyrannically clapped and crying out on the top of question, and again, it's serious. There's a real degree of sophistication. They're discussing, drama. What makes for great drama? What are the best dramaturgical approaches? But I can't help but laugh when Jonson characterizes John Marston and has him literally on stage in Poetaster vomiting pretentious words. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying about this being an entertainment industry, and it seems
Oh
that
yeah.
audiences really enjoyed watching
Oh yeah.
those young boys spitting these acidic lines between playing companies and between playhouses.
Yeah. What entertainment. Well, I wanted to visit a little bit. I used the word encyclopedic in description of your book, but what has always fascinated me and mystified me is the memories that these people had, and of course the memories of the actors in the acting companies. And we see this very clearly when Hamlet is trying to remember the sophisticated drama for the player king, and he bumbles a bit, right? And then this guy picks up like almost
Yeah.
like halfway through, and he knows the play, and it's an obscure play. It's not a
Yeah.
main, yeah,
Caviar to the general. Yes.
yeah. So
Yeah.
how was it just that our brain, their brains function differently than ours? I don't know. Or maybe we have more to keep in our brains and they had less and therefore could fill them up with, I don't know. Um,
That that for me is so important, that emphasis on memory, and in particular our role memory. And
yeah,
I think
yeah,
Shakespeare is quite idiosyncratic in that he often writes of hearing rather than seeing a play.
yeah,
When we think of A Midsummer Night's Dream, when we think of Hamlet, when we think of The Taming of the Shrew, there's lots of examples of characters saying, "We will hear a play." And I
yeah,
think that the Hamlet example is wonderful because Hamlet is able to recall a 13-line speech with good
yeah,
accent and good discretion,
yeah,
despite having only heard the speech once. But it was never acted, apparently. And I think to succeed as an Elizabethan player, as an actor during the period, you needed prodigious skills in memorization. You're putting on multiple plays, potentially 6 days a week. You've probably got around 3 weeks of rehearsal, and you might be doubling roles as well. And plays are often revived. So you might be returning to a play that you haven't performed in quite a long time. You might be going back to the Spanish tragedy, for instance. So that for me is very important. And I think that really informs Shakespeare's creative process, because you see the dexterity in which he can take lines that are buzzing around in his head, and they float back to the surface, often many years later than when these plays were originally performed. And of course, our knowledge of repertory and revival is somewhat limited. And some of these plays, such as the Jew of Malta, for example, might have been a lot more fresh, being revived in the theatres. But I
yeah.
got the sense with Shakespeare that he's remembering lines that he might very well have delivered on stage himself. I get the sense that Shakespeare would be listening to a play as a whole during performance. And I do think, judging by the borrowings from plays in rival theatrical repertoires, that occasionally on his afternoons off, Shakespeare would go and visit other theatres. And
Yeah.
his early plays do read like patchworks of lines you find
Yeah.
in Christopher Marlowe, in Thomas Kyd, and George Peele in particular. Not so much Robert Greene, which is quite interesting. Maybe he considered Greene's phrases vile. But that was my sense, charting Shakespeare's career, was of a dramatist who often gazed wistfully into the past for inspiration. When it comes to dramatic language, he's far less imitative of the likes of Ben Jonson, for instance, even though we know he acted in some of Jonson's plays. And I quite like that. I quite like that idea of Shakespeare looking to the past for inspiration, because that's precisely what we do when we put on a Shakespeare play today. We say, look at this 400-year-old text and look how it can shine a light on what's happening in society, in the media right now in the 21st century.
Yes. Well, one thing that came to my mind reading your book is that I'm interested also, and I think we'll move on from the book to your current work and future work at this point. But I have one more comment, question, or something I'd like you to respond to, if you may. The idea of what wasn't borrowed. There's a particularly with Shakespeare and Marlowe, I'm most familiar with that. What is where Shakespeare departs from Marlowe, and where that Marlowe may have been a springboard or whatnot. But what this book will show is not only what's borrowed, but what is not.
Mm,
And that is interesting to me.
mm. My sense with Shakespeare and Marlowe, the big distinction and I link it back to Shakespeare's grammar school education. Now we don't have enrollment records for Shakespeare attending grammar school, but there is a tradition that John Shakespeare bred his son for some time in a free school, and Shakespeare would have been taught to argue in utramque partem, so voicing two sides of an argument. And I think Shakespeare does that quite wonderfully, although he can come across, in comparison to Marlowe, quite conservative at times. Whereas Marlowe, yes, he does argue in utramque partem. Dr. Fausta stands out in particular, but I think Marlowe's more bitingly satirical. And there are aspects of Marlowe plays, thinking of the conclusion to Tamburlaine the Great Part 2, for instance, or The Jew of Malta, that are more problematic for today's society than some Shakespeare plays. And sometimes we enjoy a bit of satire. We might prefer a dramatist who says it as it is, and think of Thomas Middleton, for example, with A Game at Chess, satirizing the monarchy. And of course, that ended up being the last play he would ever write. But I think Shakespeare is a very balanced writer. And I always remember giving a talk in the States on Shakespeare's works, life and times. And a lady came up to me afterwards and she said, "What do you think Shakespeare was like in real life?" And before I could answer, she said, "I think he was very opinionated." Take that exchange in what sense thou wilt. But my response was that actually I think in some respects in the works, not necessarily in terms of the opinions of the man himself, Shakespeare's the ultimate fence sitter. I think he's always flipping an interpretive coin. He's seeing both sides of an argument. And I think in many respects that tightrope act, the ways in which Shakespeare navigates quite problematic political terrain, that does distinguish him from many contemporaries who landed in jail, like Ben Jonson, like George Chapman, for instance. Shakespeare's a lot more interpretatively malleable, I think, which is a bit of a mouthful. And I think that's a contributing factor when we think of why Shakespeare. Why is Shakespeare more frequently performed and studied than his contemporary dramatists?
Yeah. Well, when I read that line, when you were going into that in your book, I thought immediately just Hamlet. This is the classic scenario right there. But Shakespeare seems to move even beyond that school training, doesn't he? The existential crisis that you wouldn't get in a Marlowe. The Marlowe, once the decision's made, you go, and people are just driven. The devil drives, right? So, the whole thing in Shakespeare, even in Macbeth, there's an existential crisis, even though he is headed where he's heading, that I don't think you'd ever see in Marlowe. Had he lived, I don't think Marlowe would have gone that direction.
And you've sort of lit the switchboard in my brain with that point, Tom, because I think Hamlet's a great example of Shakespeare's craftsmanship and his overall dramaturgy, because Hamlet's got 7 soliloquies. He's a real waffler. He's Shakespeare's largest role. He's got around 1,506 lines. So in many respects, he's one of Shakespeare's most accessible, but also one of Shakespeare's most opaque characters. And we're still trying to pluck out the heart of Hamlet's mystery. And I think you can link that back to Shakespeare's a company man who knows his fellow actors intimately. And he knows he's got Richard Burbage playing the role of Hamlet. And Burbage, renowned for eliciting pathos from audience members, also seems to have been a very early example of a Daniel Day-Lewis kind of actor, where apparently he stayed in character even when in the tiring areas, even when backstage. Now, Marlowe, on the other hand, is principally writing for Edward Alleyne, who is quite a different actor, renowned for his sonorous voice and his lengthy stride. And whenever I think of what we know of Alleyne's acting style, I often have Monty Python's Ministry of Silly Walks in mind, but which is not to denigrate Elaine in any way, but he's a very different kind of performer. He's perfect for the roles of Faustus, for Tamburlaine, and no, I don't think Marlowe would have written a character like Hamlet. Not that necessarily, had he survived to around 1600, he wouldn't have been capable of it. But just in terms of who he's writing his roles for, and that's why embedding Shakespeare in his original theatrical context is so important for me.
Yeah. Well, on the other end, I don't find, and I probably will, after we talk, I'll probably think of an exception. I don't find Shakespeare to be nearly as consistently transgressive as Marlowe. He's
No.
always pushing through, and and Shakespeare had a full career, and I don't think he
Mm,
was interested in going there. And
yeah.
those are. Well, as happened with Marlowe, you can find yourself in trouble. And apparently
Yes.
Marlowe found some sort of trouble. We're not quite sure what it was, but it's intriguing, and it was all too soon. Uh,
Yes. And he died swearing, which is how I would like to go, I think.
you know, why not? Do not go gentle into that good night. Uh,
Man after my own heart. Bit of Dylan Thomas, yes.
I thought I'd throw in the Welsh illusion there. Uh, Listen, this is a great book. Everybody should get it and read it and dive into it. It's the kind of thing. It's a bookshelf book where you can put it up and you can bring it back out if you don't remember this or that. It's indexed. It's the type of thing you can. If you're looking for details, this is a scholar's dream, but it's also good for just regular reading because there's a lot of narrative in there. We get good biography, and no lack of wit in many places. And so, what I want to do, Darren, is move a little bit. We do this in our programs as what you're doing now. I hope you're resting a little bit after that. After writing that, but I'm sure you're not. And what's happening now? What do we have coming up in the future?
Well, thank you so much for your kind words about the book, and it's such a privilege to have you read it. And what you said about the book, I think, sort of vindicates what I was hoping for, really. That I wanted to produce a book that if you were a more general reader who maybe knew a little bit about Shakespeare, you could just enjoy the narrative. But I was very keen for the scholarly, the academic foundation of the book to be in place. So if you're that way inclined, you can lose yourself down a lot of rabbit holes in the end notes, I think. And for me, this is an affordable book. And we were talking about the Robert Greene book and the Thomas Kidd book, and the hardbacks of those, they're essentially geared towards universities and libraries, and there's a lot of work that goes into the writing. What I've really appreciated about this book is the reading, not just on my own part, but trying to have conversations with people that they read the book and hopefully they enjoy it. And I've just encountered so many different perspectives from people who've read this book. So I guess that's a long way of saying that I haven't started another book yet. I've just been enjoying the ensuing narrative with this book. I do have ideas for a fourth book, and they're very wispy, but I think they would probably revolve around the 1664 third folio, because I think, rightly so, 2023, there were all sorts of global celebrations for the 1623 first folio. But I think there's some interesting stories to tell about the third folio in terms of the personnel involved in the printing and publication of it, and those 7 plays that were added to that edition. How do you distinguish the third folio from the second of 1632 or from the first? Well, you add 7 plays. Only one of those, Pericles, we believe to actually feature Shakespeare's hands. And I think there's all sorts of interesting stories to tell about those plays and some of the writers we believe were involved in producing those texts. So it's a very wispy idea, and I think it would be a huge endeavor. But at some point, I might turn my attention towards the third folio. And of course, currently working on the collected works of Thomas Kidd with general editor Brian Vickers. So we're on the brink of submitting the materials for volume 2. And I'm general editor for the collected plays of Robert Greene. So projected for 2028 potentially. So that's very exciting. And I recently had the privilege to be invited to guest edit a special issue of The Explicator on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And that's an issue that's designed to help some of Shakespeare's fellow writers just edge a little bit out of his critical shadow and explicate dialogues between their works and Shakespeare's. And it's an incredibly diverse issue, and the contributing authors have just been fantastic. So I think we're nearly there with that issue.
There's so much value in what you are doing. For those outside of the field, it's very difficult to find editions of these all Shakespeare dramas and in any recent time, and that you're doing this service is wonderful. And also it will help to promote them. You know, we can write all the criticism we want and say, listen, these guys are good, these guys are, but if the editions are not there and available, then what good is it? You know, if the people cannot find them. I like that so much. And I also think that as an editor, and when you're talking about the folios, we're talking about a collaboration on another level here, because when you edit a play, you are collaborating with all of the prior editors. Shakespeare I'm sure, if you're just mind-boggling amount of information that you have to do. You have to choose in cases. I'm not sure. I'm better on Shakespeare than I am on Kidd and Greene. I'm not sure how many variants you run across, you know, with two different publications where you have to collate or collaborate two different versions. But I'm sure there are annotations that you just have to make countless decisions about how you collaborate there, and also how you're going to collaborate with the reader, how you're going to keep the reader in it without inundating them with detail. Those are hard choices to make.
Yeah, but it's they're choices I enjoy making, and because it comes down to collaboration. It's tracing influences, isn't it? It's borrowed feathers where you're taking a look at how other editors have approached these works, and that was something that shocked me, to be honest. When I was working on this book, discovering when the last like major critical editions of many of these writers' works were produced, and you know some writers are well due new editions of their works. So this is the first edition, critical edition of Thomas Kidd's work since 1901, for instance, with Frederick S. Bowers, who did a great service in terms of actually producing an edition of Kidd's collected works, but also I think has done lasting damage to Thomas Kidd's critical reputation by framing him as this workman in comparison to the luminescence of his fellow lodger Christopher Marlowe. And this will be the first collected edition of Robert Greene's plays since 1909. I think we need new editions of the likes of John Lilly, Thomas Dekker, John Fletcher and co. That's going to be a huge undertaking, but my goodness, we need it, because that's how we can appreciate these plays as readers, but also for creatives as well, that they have that basis to put these plays on, and hopefully audiences can enjoy them.
Yeah, well, what you're doing is a wonderful service, and I just can't believe, we're talking over a century, right? You wouldn't think that would be the case, but again, that is part of the eclipsing nature of Shakespeare. People go there, and that really depreciates so many meanings within Shakespeare, as you've pointed out in your book. Well, I have kept you during your morning. Anyone who is putting out, well, you have 3 books in 2 years here. Come on. I'm sure I'm keeping you from doing something absolutely urgent right now. It's your morning, it's my evening. And so I'm not going to hold you much longer here, Darren. What I wanted to do was very much you along with, well, you have this dual ability because there are people who are in editing. We've known them. I've studied under them, who are not the best in terms of promoting their own work and coming out in public and talking in any jovial way. It's a field that has been replete with a curmudgeonly behavior throughout history. Nobody now, of course, but my experience in dealing with textual editors, it can turn you into a curmudgeon very quickly. And you're not one, and you keep a very positive spin, and you get out in public. You're very public, just like Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's contemporaries and so forth, they're out there in public. So I really appreciate you coming on. This is your second time, and what I want to do is just close with that. And thank you so very, very much for yet another very, very fine work.
Tom, I could spend all day talking to you. Honestly, it's been so wonderful. And yes, in terms of being a public figure, I'm very much a people person, and I love having those conversations. And yes, sometimes you can feel like you're banging a drum and probably inflicting damage on people's ears. But from some of the conversations I've had, and the different perspectives I've encountered, I think that means a lot to me. Being able to bring Shakespeare and his contemporaries to the fore, and it offers opportunities to have conversations like we have had today, which is, these are lasting memories. We talked about memories earlier, but I so enjoyed my first conversation with you, and it's just been wonderful to catch up with you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, too. My pleasure.